Hi everybody. Tonight I invite you to drift gently with me into the soft twilight of a world long past, where silken kimonos rustled through lantern-lit corridors, and secrets were kept behind rice paper walls. We begin our story with a quiet glimpse into the life of a woman whose name history never recorded, but whose presence once breathed quietly within the lacquered confines of a noble estate in feudal Japan. This is a tale not of grandeur or power, but of quiet endurance, whispered moments, and the delicate balance of beauty and sorrow. A day in the life of a concubine, silent, graceful, and unseen by the world, begins here. The moon had just dipped beneath the ink-black clouds when she first stirred, her body wrapped tightly in a futon laid neatly on the tatami mat floor. The air in her chamber was still, scented faintly with sandalwood and plum blossom, and the paper windows glowed softly in the fading moonlight. It was the hour before dawn, a time when the world still breathed in dreams, and yet she was already awake, as she was every day, before the first bell from the temple echoed through the valley. Her name was Aoi. At least, that was the name given to her within the estate. Perhaps it had not always been her name. Perhaps she had been born with another, one whispered fondly by a mother long ago. But names were fluid here, changed as easily as a kimono, shaped to please the ear of a lord. Aoi did not rise at once. For a few breaths longer, she lingered in the stillness, listening to the rustling wind that slipped between the thin walls of the women's quarters. There was a peace in this hour, a sacred hush before the rituals of the day began. Her body ached faintly from the stillness of sleep, and her mind floated in the grey space between night and waking. The other women would soon begin to stir, some younger, some older, each bearing the same quiet fate, to live within the palace, treasured and yet confined, a blossom admired but never permitted to bloom freely. The concubines were not wives, though they bore the children of their lord. They were not servants, though they performed the tasks of grooming and grace. They were somewhere between, honoured yet not sovereign. When the first flicker of golden light crept through the screens, Aoi moved. Her bare feet brushed the cold floor, and she folded her bedding into a perfect square, placing it beside her small wooden chest. Her kimono for the day was already laid out, as it had been the night before, soft lavender, embroidered with falling cherry petals. She dressed in silence, each layer wrapped with care, the motions as familiar as breathing. There was comfort in ritual. Every morning followed the same rhythm. She would cleanse her face with cool water from a porcelain bowl, then comb her hair, long, dark, and sleek, until it shone like river stones. Her makeup was minimal at this hour. Only later, if summoned, would she apply the full paint of her role, white powder, crimson lips, a delicate sweep of ink to shape her eyes. Outside, the sound of the estate slowly awoke, the clatter of wooden sandals in the servants' yard, the low hum of voices in the kitchen, the faint chime of wind bells hanging from the eaves. Aoi slipped into the outer room, where a tray had already been placed. Rice, pickled vegetables, and a bowl of miso soup, steaming gently. She ate slowly, savouring each bite, though appetite rarely stirred. It was not hunger that guided her, but the need to maintain strength to be ready. The morning passed in quiet duties. The concubines were expected to maintain their chambers, to assist in tending the inner garden, and sometimes to practice calligraphy or music under the eye of the senior matron. Aoi had always been graceful with the koto, her fingers coaxing soft melodies from the strings, though few ever listened. The music was not for the ears of others, it was for poise, for discipline, for the image of refinement. Mid-morning sunlight poured into the corridors by then, casting latticed shadows upon the floors. In the garden, where a small pond mirrored the sky, Aoi knelt beside a patch of moss, trimming errant sprigs with tiny shears. The scent of damp earth and bamboo filled the air, and for a brief moment she felt almost free, like a crane resting by a still lake, its wings folded gently, its thoughts hidden. Then came the bell. One soft chime, carried through the corridors by a servant in muted robes. It was not a command, but an invitation. The Lord had requested her presence. Aoi bowed low, her hands still flecked with soil, and rose without a word. She knew the path by heart, every polished step of it. Back in her chamber, the transformation began. The makeup was applied with meticulous care. Her attendants, a pair of girls barely older than children, combed her hair into an elegant coif, inserting pins of silver and jade. The lavender kimono was replaced with one of deeper hue, crimson and gold, embroidered with dragons. Around her waist, the obi was tied into a precise knot, wide and proud. Each detail spoke of allure, yet Aoi's expression remained unchanged, serene, unreadable. The walk to the inner rooms was quiet, her steps muffled by the soft soles of her sandals. She passed through hallways lined with painted screens, scenes of cranes in flight, pine trees in mist, and waterfalls cascading down dreamlike cliffs. The guards did not look at her, nor did the other servants. She had become a figure of ceremony, an ornament of the court. The Lord's chamber was dim and fragrant with incense. He reclined upon silk cushions, his robes rich with embroidery, his expression distant. He did not speak at first, merely gestured for her to sit beside him. Aoi bowed low, then folded herself neatly at his side. Words were not always needed. Her presence was enough, a calming presence, a stillness amid the endless stir of politics and ambition. The day would continue, as it always did, and in the hours that followed, Aoi would return to her chamber, wash the paint from her face, and sit once more by the garden window, watching the breeze stir the leaves. The sun would arc across the sky, the shadows lengthen, and night would fall again. But that, my friends, is a moment we shall visit later. Let the hush of this first part linger with you now, like the last breath before a dream. Would you like me to continue with the next part? The sun hung high above the tiled rooftops, casting a gentle warmth upon the estate as Aoi sat once more by the latticed window of her chamber. The encounter with the Lord had passed like a breath, quiet, formal, without any great declaration. There was no embrace, no open affection. And yet the simplicity of the moment lingered in her limbs, as though she had become a part of something ancient, something far beyond her comprehension. Outside, the garden rippled softly under the noon breeze. Bamboo leaves shimmered like tiny fans, their shadows dancing on the worn stones below. Somewhere beyond the walls, a crane called, its voice long and low, echoing faintly across the fields. Aoi's fingers traced the edge of her sleeve, the silk cool beneath her touch. There was stillness within her, but it was not peace. It was a practiced stillness, like the surface of a pond where koi swim silently beneath. She rose slowly and removed the formal kimono with care, folding it into a lacquered chest as the young attendants gathered the pins and brushes from her dressing table. They said little, those girls, trained to be silent, to observe without leaving a trace of themselves. Aoi saw in them what she once had been, uncertain, malleable, waiting to be shaped by a world that rarely spoke its intent. In the quiet that followed, she changed into a simple robe of soft grey and returned to the garden path that looped behind the main hall. Here, away from the formality of chambers and courtly expectations, she could breathe more freely. Moss softened the edges of the stones, and a small stream whispered secrets as it passed under an arched bridge. She walked slowly, savouring each step, her eyes lowered, not out of humility, but to drink in the textures of the earth, the curling ferns, the fallen cherry petals, the glint of sunlight on damp wood. This was the part of the day she cherished most. In the hours between duty and dusk, she was allowed to slip into something quieter, something resembling her truest self. Not the painted concubine, not the chosen companion of a powerful man, but simply Aoi, a woman among gardens, held by no one, asking nothing. Beneath a wide-armed pine, she found her favourite bench and settled there, folding her legs beneath her. A small sparrow hopped nearby, cocking its head in curiosity, before fluttering up into the branches. She watched it without moving, letting the hush of the place wash over her. Somewhere beyond the estate, the village children would be laughing, chasing each other through rice fields. Their lives, though poorer, seemed in many ways richer, full of unbound moments, free of veils and lacquered masks. Aoi closed her eyes, and for a time she remembered. She remembered the village where she was born, tiny and nestled in the valley, where the mist rolled down the hills like silk each morning. Her mother had grown herbs and stitched fabric by the fire. Her father, before he was taken by fever, had carved toys from soft wood. There had been laughter there, real and unguarded, and though the meals were meagre, the warmth of their presence had filled her as nothing else ever had. She had been sold during a lean winter. The memory was not sharp, it had blurred over time, softened by repetition and retelling. But she could still recall the ache in her mother's arms as they embraced one last time, the taste of salt on her lips, the scent of smoke clinging to her hair. A noble official had taken her, promising coin and comfort. She had been 10 years old. Now, nearly a decade later, she sat in a palace, clothed in silks and surrounded by beauty. Yet her heart remained tethered to a distant place, to the sound of wooden sandals on wet earth, to the warm glow of firelight upon her mother's face. She did not resent her place in the estate. Resentment required energy, and energy was a luxury. She had learned instead to float, to endure, to find softness where she could. The shadows began to stretch long across the stones, and the wind grew cooler. Aoi stood, brushing a speck of dust from her sleeve, and turned toward the east garden, where the elder concubines sometimes gathered to speak in low, measured tones. She did not always join them, but today the weight of memory felt heavy, and the thought of shared silence comforted her. They sat beneath a cherry tree, its blossoms pale against the dusk sky. One woman, with hair streaked silver, played softly on a shakuhachi flute, the sound winding gently through the branches like drifting smoke. Another worked at embroidery, her needle rising and falling in a steady rhythm. They did not greet Aoi with words, only with the smallest nods of recognition. She knelt beside them, folding her hands in her lap. The conversation, when it came, was quiet. Fragmented stories of days long past, tales of dreams once carried like precious vases, now cracked and shelved in the corners of their minds. They did not weep or rage. They spoke with the softness of those who had come to accept the shape of their lives, who found solace in small rituals, shared glances, the rhythm of routine. As night slowly descended, lanterns were lit along the verandas. Their soft amber glow flickered like fireflies against the darkening sky. Aoi returned to her chamber, her heart a little quieter, her mind a little clearer. She lit a single candle, its flame steady in the still air, and began to write in her journal. A few lines of poetry, nothing elaborate, just enough to place her thoughts where she could see them. She wrote of the pine tree, the sparrow, the memory of her mother's touch. She did not write of the Lord, not out of disrespect, but because that part of her life did not belong to her alone. It was a role she played, a scene in a never-ending play. What she wrote belonged only to herself, and in that private space she reclaimed the parts of her soul still untouched. When sleep came, it did so slowly. She lay upon the futon once more, her hands resting on her chest, her breaths long and even. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the faint sound of the shakuhachi still echoed in her mind, a lullaby without words. The estate slept, and so did she. The morning sun filtered through the paper screens with a gentle blush, casting pale golden grids upon the tatami. Aoi stirred with the faintest motion, her breathing already settled into the rhythm of wakefulness. She had slept, though lightly, her dreams fragile and translucent like the mist that floated above the pond at dawn. Before rising, she remained still a while longer, listening. The estate was beginning to wake once more. From beyond the walls came the familiar sounds, the soft sweep of a broom against stone, the distant clack of wooden sandals, the low rustle of silk robes. It was a language of quiet repetition, unchanging and undemanding. She rose and dressed in the same deliberate manner, each fold of her robe carefully arranged, each movement a silent meditation. Today's kimono was the colour of pale jade, embroidered with tiny wisteria blooms that trailed like sighs down the sleeves. There was no rush. Time in the estate moved like water in a slow stream, unhurried, persistent, ever circling back upon itself. As she stepped into the corridor, the scent of early plum blossoms reached her. Winter had just begun to loosen its grip, and with the coming of spring, the trees responded tenderly, cautiously, like a secret lover returning after long absence. The breeze carried a chill still, but it was no longer cruel. It whispered of change, of beginnings, though for Aoi such things were not so easily claimed. She moved toward the inner garden, not for duty, but for solitude. The garden was always there, waiting in silence, with its moss-covered stones and tiny rivulets threading their way between the roots of ancient pines. This morning the sun shimmered gently upon the surface of the pond, and a pair of white koi glided just beneath, their tails flicking like ink strokes in slow motion. Aoi sat on a smooth stone, tucking her legs beneath her. Her hands, folded in her lap, trembled ever so slightly, not from fear or chill, but from the stir of something unnamed. Some mornings brought her this way, a sense of softness and longing, a hollow filled with memories, or perhaps merely the shape of what had never come to pass. The silence of the garden was not empty. It held layers of sound so fine they could be missed. Dew sliding down a leaf, the flutter of a moth's wings against a lantern, the hush of breath drawn in reverence. She listened to it all, allowing her thoughts to move like the wind through bamboo, light, ungrasped, fleeting. A voice broke gently through the morning air. "You favour this place." Aoi turned her head slightly. The speaker was Lady Tamae, one of the elder concubines. Her presence was always marked by a serene authority, her posture graceful, her voice soft but precise. She was draped in a robe of ivory and teal, her hair coiled neatly, adorned only by a single pearl pin. Aoi bowed her head in greeting, her words measured and polite. "It is quiet. It allows me to breathe." Lady Tamae smiled faintly and settled beside her, a short distance away, careful not to disturb the stones or the soft earth. For a few moments they simply watched the koi together, their reflections rippling slightly in the pond. "I used to come here when I was your age," Tamae said at last, her gaze distant. "In spring, when the plum blossoms open. I would imagine they were letters from the past, unopened, unread, left beneath the branches." Aoi listened, intrigued but silent. "We are not free," Tamae continued, her tone without bitterness. "But even within these walls, one must find a path inward. The heart must be allowed to move, even if the body cannot." Aoi turned her eyes to the blossoms drifting lazily in the water. "Do you still find that path?" she asked quietly. Tamae did not answer at once. Instead, she reached into her sleeve and withdrew a tiny slip of folded paper. She offered it to Aoi without ceremony. "Each year I write a poem to the wind," she said. "A foolish tradition, but it helps me mark time, not with days, but with words." Aoi unfolded the paper gently. The ink was precise, delicate. Beneath quiet limbs the wind forgets who it was, plum petals drifting. She read it twice, the weight of the syllables lingering in her breath. Then she folded it once more and returned it with reverence. "It is not foolish," she said. They sat in companionable silence until the sun rose higher and the warmth pressed gently against their backs. Then Lady Tamae stood with the elegance of practiced years and walked away, her figure vanishing slowly behind the bend in the path. Left alone once more, Aoi remained by the pond. Her thoughts returned to the poem, to the idea of the wind forgetting itself. Was that not, in some way, the same as their lives? Each day another petal fell, another trace of who she had once been lost to the quiet current of time. Later that day, during her lessons in calligraphy, her hand hesitated over the rice paper. The brush hovered, then dipped in ink, then rose again. She wrote not the characters she had been instructed to copy, but her own. Though the gate is closed, the heart slips between the stones, a bird in shadow. It was not meant for anyone's eyes, and yet the act of writing it gave her breath, gave her shape. She folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her robe. By evening, the sky had turned to lavender. The lanterns were lit again, and the corridors glowed with soft light. Aoi walked them slowly, her fingers trailing along the painted screens. She passed others, servants, attendants, women in muted robes, but the hush between them remained undisturbed. Back in her chamber, she removed her robe and combed her hair with long strokes, her gaze unfocused. The wind stirred faintly through the open screen, and she paused to watch the branches swaying gently, the blossoms falling one by one. She did not write in her journal that night. Some thoughts, she had learned, were best left unwritten, floating softly in the silence like plum petals on water. She lay down and the quiet held her. The estate, once again, slipped into its nightly rhythm. Aoi closed her eyes and imagined the wind, soft, forgetful, carrying her somewhere just beyond the walls. In the hush of early morning, before the first bird had sung and before any footstep touched the stones of the inner courtyard, Aoi was already awake. The sky beyond her paper screens bore the hue of faint ash, a pale and colourless veil that awaited the stroke of dawn. She sat upright on her futon, the blanket still drawn lightly over her knees, and for a time simply breathed. The quiet before the day was a sacred threshold, neither night nor morning, but something in between, where thought and memory gathered like mist. Today was a ceremonial day. She had known it would come. The elder matron had mentioned it in passing the week before, her voice low and without inflection. It was the day of the seasonal offering, a private rite held within the most secluded rooms of the estate, where only select concubines would attend. The Lord would preside, observing the age-old rituals passed down from generations of noble houses. It was an honor to be chosen, but it was also a reminder of one's place, one's silence, one's service to beauty and tradition. Aoi washed in silence, the water cold against her skin. Her breath formed little clouds in the morning air, and the porcelain bowl clinked faintly as she set it aside. Her attendants soon arrived, their heads bowed, their movements swift and practiced. They laid out her garments with precision, layers of silk dyed in the rich shades of early spring, crimson, ivory, and storm grey, each one embroidered with fine threads of silver. Her hair was gathered high and adorned with pins shaped like plum blossoms. Her face, painted with the meticulous care of a craftsman, reflected back at her like a stranger's, a mask of elegance, unmoved by emotion, perfected into stillness. By the time she stepped through the corridor toward the inner sanctum, the estate had fully woken. The scent of incense curled through the air like a forgotten song, and the gentle clack of sandals echoed softly around her. Every part of the journey was ritual, the pace of her walk, the tilt of her head, the silence she wore like a second kimono. She passed through sliding screens painted with cranes and pine, and through archways carved with motifs of waves and clouds. Inside the ceremonial room, the light was dimmed by gauze screens, giving the chamber a hushed, reverent tone. A dais had been arranged with lacquer trays bearing offerings, seasonal fruits, small bowls of salt, sprigs of evergreen. The Lord sat at a raised platform beyond the offerings, robed in the deep indigo of ceremonial garb, his gaze inscrutable. Aoi knelt, along with 2 other concubines selected for the ritual. Each of them wore different colours, their faces nearly identical beneath the makeup, expressions composed and unreadable. They bowed in unison, their foreheads nearly touching the tatami. A servant chanted softly from a scroll, the syllables rising and falling like ripples across a pond. No one spoke beyond what was required. That was the nature of ceremony, words distilled into gestures, emotions dissolved into posture. Aoi's hands moved as instructed, her movements fluid and slow. She lifted a bowl, offered a bow, poured a libation, and replaced the vessel with the grace of a practiced performer. It was like dancing without music, steps known by memory, not rhythm. When the rite ended, the Lord gave a simple nod. His expression did not change, and he did not rise. The concubines bowed deeply once more and retreated, their heads lowered, their forms floating like shadows across the tatami. Aoi did not look back. By midday, she had returned to her quarters. Her robes changed to simpler ones, her hair let down in a long, dark river down her back. The makeup had been removed with scented cloths, and her bare face stared back at her from a small bronze mirror. In it she saw not beauty nor wariness, but something harder to name, a stillness she had not chosen, yet had grown into. She walked into the garden again, her feet finding the familiar stones. A wind had picked up since morning, carrying with it the sharp edge of melting snow. In the eastern grove, she found an old bamboo bench and sat, her hands tucked into her sleeves. The ceremonial stillness clung to her skin like perfume. Lady Tamai appeared not long after, walking with the measured pace of one who knew how to fill silence. She carried a folded cloth in her hands, and when she reached Aoi, she unfurled it carefully. Inside was a simple object, a stone, smooth and worn, its surface polished by time and touch. "This was given to me many years ago," Tamai said, "by a woman who once sat where you now sit." Aoi looked at the stone. It was pale grey, flecked with darker spots and oddly shaped like a teardrop. She said it was a token of what cannot be spoken, a shape for the feeling that finds no form in words. Tamai placed the stone on the bench between them, not pushing it toward Aoi, not offering it directly, just letting it be. A quiet presence, a secret laid bare in silence. Aoi did not speak, but her eyes, when they met the older woman's, held a softness that needed no explanation. As the afternoon faded, Aoi remained in the grove long after Tamai had gone. She picked up the stone and turned it over in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. It warmed slowly in her hand. She closed her fingers around it, and held it against her chest just once before slipping it into the fold of her sleeve. Back in her chamber that night, she placed the stone on her windowsill. The candlelight shimmered gently over it, and outside the wind moved through the trees like a distant lullaby. Sleep came easily, and in her dreams she walked barefoot through the garden, the petals falling around her like snow, the air thick with scent and song. The ceremony was over, but something lingered still. A weight, a memory, a beginning. The days that followed the ceremony slipped by with the calm persistence of water flowing beneath ice, silent, inevitable, unnoticed by most. In the soft rhythm of the estate, where bells marked time more gently than clocks and footsteps echoed through empty corridors, Aoi found herself returning more and more to quiet corners, places where time seemed to fold into itself. She rose each morning in stillness, washed in silence, and dressed beneath the pale light of dawn. Her movements had become so instinctive that she often forgot she was moving at all, like a branch bending in the wind, unaware of its grace. Each fold of fabric, each knot in her obi, each stroke of her comb across her hair was a thread in the tapestry of her day, woven without thought, yet full of unspoken meaning. The stone Lady Tamai had given her remained on the windowsill, where it caught the morning sun and the hush of evening equally well. Aoi found herself glancing at it often, not seeking anything, not asking, just remembering that it was there. Its simple presence had become a kind of quiet reassurance, a small anchor against the drifting nature of life within the walls. That morning, a gentle rain began to fall. The sound of it, soft against the tiled rooftops, hissing as it slipped through bamboo leaves, was a comfort. The estate always grew quieter during rain. The clatter of movement softened. The chatter of servants diminished. Even the birdsong dimmed beneath the weight of falling water. It was as though the world took a breath and decided not to exhale. Aoi sat by the veranda, her robe drawn around her, and watched the droplets roll down the wooden rails. Each one caught the light, turned briefly into a pearl, then vanished. The garden shimmered with wetness, the pond dimpled gently, and the moss beneath the trees darkened into deep green velvet. She could smell the rain, earthy, metallic, alive. She brought a writing box to her lap and unfolded a fresh sheet of paper. With slow, practiced care, she dipped her brush and began to write. Not a journal entry, not a letter, but simple thoughts as they came. Rain over plum trees. I sit with my hands folded, watching myself drift. She let the ink dry slowly, the scent of it mingling with the rain. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into a small wooden drawer beneath her table, where similar writings had gathered like pressed flowers over time, each one a whisper of who she had been on a certain morning. Later in the day, word reached her that the Lord would not require companionship that evening. Such news was always delivered without expression, as if it bore no significance. Yet Aoi felt the shift immediately. It meant the evening was her own. No painting of the face, no scenting of the hair, no practiced stillness. It meant she could walk as she pleased, within the boundaries allowed, and let the dusk fall around her without needing to adorn it. She chose to visit the West Corridor, a part of the estate rarely walked by the concubines. It bordered the rear gardens and overlooked a section of forest where tall trees formed a natural screen beyond the boundary wall. Few ventured there, for it led nowhere and held no ceremonial use. But Aoi found it soothing. Its neglect had preserved its stillness. The corridor smelled of cedar and rain. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath her steps, and spiderwebs shimmered in the corners, undisturbed by brooms or hands. Through the open screens, she could see the forest beyond, mist rising between the trunks, leaves heavy with water, a kind of primal silence deeper than the estate itself. She stopped where the corridor widened slightly into a viewing alcove, where an old bench had been placed beneath a carved lattice. She sat there, pulling her robe closer, and breathed in the scent of damp wood and distant pine. The world beyond the walls seemed impossibly vast, and yet here she was, tethered within this quiet place, watching it all unfold. A small movement caught her eye. Near the edge of the wall, where a break in the stones allowed a sliver of forest to intrude, a deer had stepped into view. Slender, with a coat like brushed copper, it stood motionless, nose twitching. It must have strayed close during the rain, drawn by the hush, the safety of stillness. Aoi did not move. The deer turned its head slightly as if sensing her, though she knew she was well concealed. They watched one another for a moment that stretched into something more, a wordless exchange between two creatures who had grown used to silence. Then the deer lowered its head and, with a grace Aoi could never imitate, stepped away and vanished behind the curtain of trees. She remained still for some time, listening to the rustle of leaves, the trickle of water, the ache in her chest she had not realized was there. When she finally returned to her chamber, evening had settled like a soft shawl across the estate. She lit a single lantern and sat by the window once more. The stone was cool beneath her fingers. She turned it over, pressed it briefly to her cheek, then set it down again. She did not write that night. Instead, she listened to the slow dripping of rain from the eaves, to the far-off cry of an owl, to the memory of the deer and the soft regard it had given her. In that moment, Aoi felt the world was not as closed as it seemed. Even within the stillness there were doors, quiet ones hidden by mist that opened not outward but inward. The morning after the rain was crystalline, fresh, and hushed in a different way. The air held a certain clarity that only came after storms, cool and glass-like, as though the world had been rinsed and laid anew before the eyes. The clouds had thinned, scattered like silk strands across the sky, and the estate shimmered beneath a sheen of dew. Aoi stepped onto the veranda outside her chamber and inhaled deeply. The scent of pine and wet stone rose up to greet her. The garden was luminous in its quiet way, each blade of grass rimmed with moisture, each leaf trembling with silver droplets. She stood there a while, arms folded loosely, allowing her gaze to settle on the glistening curve of the pond, where mist still hovered above the surface. It was a day without summons, a rarity in the structured life of the concubines. There would be no audience with the Lord, no ritual observances, no lessons in music or verse. It was one of those rare gifts, a day quietly tucked between the demands of service, a day with no direction, no destination, only breath and movement. After a simple breakfast, steamed rice, pickled plum and warm tea, Aoi chose to visit the archives. Tucked deep within the northern wing of the estate, the archives were rarely spoken of among the concubines. They were neither forbidden nor encouraged. They simply were, a repository of scrolls, records, poems and painted tales from generations long past. Most saw no purpose in visiting, but Aoi had always been drawn to such places where the hush was deeper, layered with the voices of those who had come before. The corridor to the archives was lined with wooden beams darkened by time. Shadows clung to the corners, and the air grew cooler the farther she walked. A servant, young, quiet, bowed deeply, slid the door open for her and vanished again without a sound. Inside, the room opened into a high-ceilinged hall, its walls lined with cabinets and low chests. Light filtered in through latticed windows, illuminating particles of dust that drifted lazily in the air, like spirits unhurried by time. She stepped inside, removing her sandals, her feet silent on the worn floorboards. Rows of scrolls rested in neat bundles, each one tied with silk cords, labelled in delicate brushwork. Others were stacked in drawers behind sliding panels, each section marked by the era or family line it belonged to. A table stood in the centre of the room, low and broad, with cushions placed at its sides for reading. Aoi selected a scroll at random, not seeking anything, simply guided by the quiet curiosity that stirred when the world outside grew too still. She returned to the table, untied the cord, and unrolled it gently. It was a collection of seasonal poetry, short, lyrical verses written by women of the estate nearly a century before. Their names were mostly unknown, recorded only by title or by reference to their station. Third Garden Lady, Eastern Chamber Servant, daughter of the Ko clan. The words, however, were clear, elegant, trembling with longing. I pluck plum blossoms, but find no one to give them. Still I gather more. She read each line slowly, letting the cadence settle into her chest. There was a familiar ache in the verses, not sadness exactly, but the kind of yearning that took root in silence and grew without name. These women, long vanished, had lived as she lived now. They had walked the same stone paths, bowed before the same painted screens, stared at the same moon through latticed windows, and in their own way they had spoken, even if only here. Aoi spent the morning moving from one scroll to another, tracing the lives of those who had once breathed within the same walls. Some verses were playful, others mournful. Some wrote of stolen glances in the garden, others of dreams wrapped in incense smoke. One wrote simply, "The brush slips, but the ink reveals more than I intended." She paused at that one for a long while. When at last she stepped out of the archive chamber, the sun had shifted, casting warmer light across the eaves. The air was still cool, but the promise of spring stirred in the breeze. She carried no scroll with her. She had returned each one to its place, but a dozen lines of poetry hummed in her chest like soft echoes. She returned to her chamber, changed into a lighter robe of sky blue, and sat before her writing desk. There, she dipped her brush and wrote not with formality, but with feeling, allowing the memory of the morning to shape her hand. Voices on paper. They move more gently than wind, but never vanish. She did not fold this one away. Instead, she placed it on her windowsill beside the smooth stone. The ink dried slowly in the sun. That evening, as dusk deepened and the lanterns were lit once more, Aoi lit a small incense stick and let its tendrils drift across the chamber. She did not speak. She did not write again. She simply lay down, her eyes watching the rising smoke, her breath matching its rhythm. And somewhere between the sigh of flame and the touch of darkness, she felt those old voices again, close, tender, and eternal. The next morning dawned with an unusual quiet. Even for a place built upon silence, there was something different about the air, a subtle pause, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. Aoi felt it the moment she opened her eyes. The hush was deeper, heavier, threaded with the tension of something unsaid. She rose, dressed with habitual care, and listened. The usual sounds, rustling fabric, distant footsteps, the low murmur of attendants were softened, less frequent. A servant passed by her chamber, bowing briefly but saying nothing. His face was unreadable. By the time she reached the courtyard, it became clear. A visitor had arrived. Not just any visitor, but a dignitary from the northern province. A powerful daimyo known for his austere court and rigid adherence to protocol. His presence was rare and rarely welcome. It meant that all within the estate would be subject to heightened observation, to whispered instructions and sudden summons, to the invisible tightening of every thread of etiquette. Aoi watched from the garden path as the senior steward gave orders, his voice hushed but tense. The younger servants moved quickly, brushing dust from lanterns, sweeping the stones with greater precision than usual. Even the birds seemed to sense the difference, keeping to the higher branches, quiet and hidden. She retreated from the bustle and returned to her chamber, hoping to be overlooked. But by mid-morning, a summons arrived. The Lord had requested her presence, not in the private serenity of his inner chambers, but at a formal gathering in the Hall of Painted Pines, where the dignitary would be received. It was unusual for a concubine to be present during such events, and even more so for one so young. Still, the instruction was clear. Her attendants worked quickly, their hands steady, though the atmosphere in the room had thickened. Aoi's kimono was a rich indigo, embroidered with cranes and waves, and her hair was dressed more elaborately than usual, adorned with a silver comb shaped like a crescent moon. The makeup was subtle but precise, each line drawn with intention, each shade chosen to convey both humility and refinement. As she made her way toward the hall, she passed other women, some concubines, some court ladies, all casting sideways glances, curious but silent. She felt their eyes like brush strokes on her back, soft but deliberate. They would not question the Lord's choice aloud, but they would remember. The Hall of Painted Pines lived up to its name, its walls adorned with sweeping panels of pine trees rendered ink and gold, their branches curling across the room like smoke. A long table had been arranged with ceremonial offerings and small dishes, each placed with precision. The Lord sat at the head, his posture immaculate, his expression composed. To his left, the visiting daimyo, dressed in muted armor beneath his formal robes, his face a mask of rigid contemplation. Aoi entered quietly, bowing so low her forehead nearly touched the floor. She moved to a cushion prepared for her and knelt with grace, her hands folded in her lap. She did not speak, nor was she expected to. The conversation between the two men was layered in formality, phrases polished to ceremonial smoothness, each word heavy with subtext. Aoi kept her gaze lowered, focusing instead on the patterns in the tatami, the scent of the incense, the slight tremble in the flame of the candle nearby. Once, the daimyo's voice shifted slightly, a note of inquiry directed toward the lord. Aoi heard her name spoken, not directly, but by reference. The one who graces your inner garden with her presence. The tone was neither mocking nor warm. It was neutral, like a man commenting on a scroll he has not yet read. The lord replied with a soft hum. She has a stillness that suits the season. Aoi's breath caught for a moment. It was not praise, not affection, but it was, in its way, a shield. He had spoken of her as one speaks of something one values, not for beauty, but for the calm it brings. The meal was taken in silence. Aoi served with precise gestures, her hands moving like water. She poured sake, replaced dishes, bowed with each offering. She did not once look up into the faces of the men. She had been taught not to. But she could feel the daimyo's gaze linger on her, not with desire, but with curiosity, like a collector examining a lacquer box, wondering what lay hidden beneath its lid. When the gathering concluded, Aoi retreated as silently as she had arrived. She passed through the corridors once more, her heart calm but her mind stirring. The words spoken had been few, the gestures restrained, but the meaning beneath them had shifted something. Back in her chamber, she sat in front of her mirror and slowly removed the hair ornaments. Each pin, each comb was laid carefully aside, like memories set down at the end of a long thought. She washed the powder from her face, revealing once more the skin beneath, the one that bore no lacquer, no ceremony. That night she did not light a candle. She let the darkness fall as it wished. She sat by the window, the stone still in its place, the poem from the archive day resting beside it. A breeze passed through the garden, stirring the paper ever so slightly, and Aoi, without speaking, let herself be stirred with it, not by fear, nor by vanity, but by the strange unfolding of a day that had asked her to be more than a shadow. In the silence that followed, she knew. There were eyes now watching, minds turning, doors she had not meant to approach now slightly ajar. But she did not step through them. Not yet. The next day began under a pale sky, where faint clouds stretched thinly across the horizon, like threads pulled taut by unseen hands. The air was cooler, crisper, touched by the breath of early spring, and the estate had returned to its quieter rhythm after the visitor's departure. Yet even as the courtyards resumed their familiar hum, something in the atmosphere had changed, like the pause between two verses of a song, still melodious but expectant. Aoi walked slowly along the inner veranda, her fingers lightly grazing the wooden railing. The stone paths had dried from the previous rains, and the moss glowed in soft hues of green. Cherry blossoms had begun to awaken, tiny hints of pink pressing at the edges of buds. They would not bloom for another few days, perhaps longer, but even so, their scent lingered faintly in the wind, a promise folded into fragrance. She passed a pair of junior attendants scrubbing the lantern stands by the main entrance. They glanced up, then looked away quickly, heads bowed in practiced deference. Aoi did not pause. She was used to this, being seen but never truly acknowledged. It had always been so for women in her station. They were both essential and peripheral, as though the beauty they carried made them visible only when needed, then forgotten again like the scent of fading incense. Yet this time, the silence felt different. Lady Tamae found her later in the day, near the covered walkway that curved around the inner koi pond. The older woman's steps were slow but deliberate, her gaze watchful. When she spoke, it was with a softness that only those who had grown wise in silence could master. "You left an impression yesterday," Tamae said, folding her hands into her sleeves. Aoi kept her eyes on the water, where the koi traced lazy circles beneath the rippling surface. "I was not meant to. I did only what was asked." "That is often when impressions are deepest," the older woman replied. She stood beside Aoi, and for a while neither spoke. A breeze drifted through the corridor, carrying the faint sound of a bamboo wind chime from some distant corner. After a time, Tamae continued, her voice as smooth as woven silk. "There was a time, years ago, when I too was asked to attend a gathering, not so different from yours, and like you, I said little, did little, yet it changed the course of many things, none of which I asked for." Aoi turned to her slowly. "And were those changes kind?" Tamae smiled faintly. "They were what they were. Kindness is not always the hand that shapes us, but it is the hand we must offer ourselves afterward." The two women walked together a short distance, their steps echoing gently between the walls. At a small alcove near the end of the corridor, Tamai paused and withdrew a folded piece of fabric from within her sleeve. She handed it to Aoi without ceremony. Inside was a small, square cloth embroidered with plum blossoms, delicate and hand-stitched, each petal sewn with the care of someone who had stitched not for beauty, but for memory. "I made this after my gathering," she said, "when I needed to remember myself." Aoi accepted it with both hands and bowed her head. She did not need to speak. Some gifts were not meant to be responded to in words. That evening the sky turned a deep lavender, and the first stars shimmered faintly above the eaves. Aoi sat once more by her window, the small cloth folded neatly beside the smooth stone. The poem she had written days before still rested beneath the candle holder, untouched by time. She added nothing new to it. Not because there were no thoughts, but because tonight she wished only to feel. She thought of the daimyo's eyes, impassive but observant. She thought of the Lord's voice, and how he had spoken of her stillness, not as praise, but as placement, as though she were a brushstroke completing a painting. She thought of Tamai, and the small worn hands that had once stitched plum blossoms not for ornament, but for remembrance. And then, softly, she reached for the little cloth and pressed it to her chest. Outside, the wind carried the first petals of early bloom across the veranda, where they settled in the corners like quiet prayers. Aoi did not sleep immediately. She sat in the dark, allowing the softness of the cloth to remind her of something she had almost forgotten. That even within stillness there was movement. That even behind silence there were stories. And that even in the shadow of great halls and painted pines, a woman might yet find the shape of her own breath and name it hers. The days began to stretch, each one slightly longer than the last. Spring crept forward in its careful, deliberate way, peeling back the last layers of winter. In the early morning light, the estate appeared softer, almost dreamlike. Shadows lingered just a little longer, and the sun's warmth came not with haste, but with quiet patience. Aoi woke to birdsong, delicate and hesitant, like a musician rehearsing a forgotten tune. She lay still beneath her futon, listening. The sound drifted in through the screen panels, carried on a breeze that stirred the paper just enough to create the faintest flutter. She rose slowly, the floor cool beneath her feet, and moved through her morning routine without urgency. Her robe for the day was a shade of pale mauve, soft and unpatterned, save for a single embroidered crane near the hem. It was a robe for days of solitude, worn when no eyes were meant to linger and no expectations were pressed upon the hour. By mid-morning, Aoi found herself once again in the rear garden, where a narrow path wound between old stones and thick stands of bamboo. The garden was rarely visited, too far from the central rooms, and without the grandeur of the more curated spaces. But she preferred it. Here the wildness was less tamed, and the air felt older, as though the trees remembered things the walls had long forgotten. She paused near a low stone lantern, its top covered in moss, and looked up. The first cherry blossoms had begun to bloom. Only a few, shy and half open, their petals trembling with dew. But they were there, rising from the branches like pale sighs against the sky. Aoi reached up but did not touch them. Instead, she stood beneath the tree, her face turned upward, and let herself feel the moment. The way the air cooled beneath the shade, the gentle ache in her chest, the scent that hovered just at the edge of memory. Later, she found herself seated on the veranda with a brush in her hand and a blank sheet of paper before her. The brush hovered, then descended. The blossoms return, but I am not who I was when last they opened. She let the ink dry, then folded the paper in half and placed it beside the others in the lacquer box beneath her desk. Each one marked a day, a feeling, a moment she did not want to lose. Not because the world would forget her if she didn't write them down, but because she herself might. By afternoon, word arrived that a travelling troupe of performers had been invited to the estate. It was a rare event. Music, storytelling, and masks worn by men who came from distant provinces, carrying tales that had never touched noble ears. Such visits were both a gift and a message, that the world outside the estate still moved, still spun, still burned with colour and sound. The concubines were invited to attend. Not all, but several, Aoi among them. When the time came, she dressed more formally, though with understated elegance, a robe of ivory, patterned with waves and cranes, its edges touched with silver thread. Her hair was pinned high again, her face powdered lightly. But this time she did not feel adorned. She felt veiled. The performance took place in the Moon Pavilion, an open-air hall built beside the eastern pond. Lanterns had been hung in clusters, their light soft and golden, casting gentle reflections across the water. Mats were arranged in neat rows, and a low platform had been erected for the performers. Aoi sat near the front, beside a few other women from the inner quarters. The Lord was present, seated slightly above, his face unreadable as always. Nearby, attendants moved like shadows, ensuring each guest had warm tea and delicate sweets. The performance began with music, soft flutes, a gentle drum. Then the actors appeared, dressed in layered silks, their masks carved with exquisite precision. They danced slowly at first, their movements graceful and strange, telling a story without words. It was a tale of a fisherman who fell in love with the spirit of the moon. Each night he cast his net, not for fish, but for the reflection of her face. The village mocked him, but he returned to the shore again and again, until one night she answered. The moon stepped down into the sea, her feet barely touching the waves, and danced with him in the shallow waters before vanishing forever. Aoi watched in silence, her hands folded, her breath still. The story felt impossibly familiar. Not the details, but the longing. The idea of reaching for something just beyond grasp. Not foolishly, but because the heart knew no other way. As the performance ended, the final notes of the flute fading into the night, Aoi remained seated for a long time. Around her, the others rose, murmuring softly, their robes rustling like leaves. She stayed until the moon rose high above the pond, casting its reflection perfectly upon the surface. Later, in her chamber, she lit a single candle and unwrapped the small cloth Tamai had given her. She smoothed it with gentle fingers and placed it beside the poem she had written earlier that day. She stepped from the sea, not to stay, but to remind, some dreams live in mist. The night was quiet, but not empty. Outside, the blossoms stirred in the breeze, and somewhere far beyond the walls, the sound of a distant drum echoed once more, faint and low like a heartbeat beneath the world. Aoi closed her eyes, and in her dream she stood by the sea, waiting, not for rescue, not for transformation, but simply to witness the dance. The morning after the performance was silken and grey, with clouds drawn low across the sky like curtains yet to be pulled aside. The wind was gentle but carried with it the breath of water, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled slowly from a neighbouring temple, its echo drifting across the valley with a sound that clung to the skin. Aoi awoke with the memory of the fisherman still lingering in her thoughts, not just the tale itself, but the aching beauty of its telling. She moved through her morning routine with a softness that matched the weather outside, the weight of the night's story hanging in her gestures, shaping her silence. No summons came that day, no request from the Lord, no duty called. It was a rare gap in the estate's rhythm, a hollow space left open like an unwritten stanza. Aoi welcomed it. There was something sacred about a day without instruction. She dressed simply, a robe of deep forest green, embroidered only at the cuffs, its weight comforting. Her hair was left loosely tied, falling across her shoulders in a cascade of dark silk. She stepped outside and found the garden wrapped in mist, every leaf kissed with tiny drops of water. The koi pond was still, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish just beneath. She followed the winding path past the lantern stones and toward the rear gate, a part of the estate rarely travelled. There, nestled among a copse of bamboo, was a small shrine dedicated to the spirit of spring rain. The shrine itself was humble, just a wooden platform beneath a gnarled plum tree, with a stone basin for offerings and a rope hung with folded paper charms. Few came here. Perhaps they had forgotten its presence, or perhaps they feared what it reminded them of. Aoi approached slowly and knelt before the basin. She poured a ladle of water over her hands, then pressed her palms together in a quiet prayer, not for change nor fortune, but for clarity, for the ability to see her own heart more clearly, even if the world beyond remained uncertain. She remained there a long while, listening to the wind whisper through the bamboo, the low murmur of water in the stone trough, the soft creak of the ancient plum branches above her. When she finally rose, she noticed something unusual. Tucked between two stones at the edge of the path was a folded paper charm, new, unweathered by rain, its corners crisp. She stooped and picked it up carefully. There were no markings on the outside, no names or symbols, only the faint scent of ink. Inside, however, was a short poem written in a hand that was not hers. She walks like the wind, not to stir the world around, but to remind it. Aoi stood still, her breath held between thought and question. It was not uncommon for people in the estate to exchange poems. But this was different. This was hidden, deliberately placed, as though meant for her, and her alone. She did not know who had written it. Perhaps one of the poets among the staff. Perhaps someone who had watched her in silence, seeing more than she had offered. She folded it again and placed it in the inner fold of her robe, close to her heart. The mystery of its origin did not disturb her. Rather, it filled her with a quiet warmth, like a cup of tea held between cold hands. Later that day, she returned to the archive room, drawn not by obligation, but by a desire to be near the voices of those who had once lived as she did. The room was dim, lit by a single window, and smelled of old wood and ink. She chose a scroll at random, this time a collection of moon poems, written by women of the court nearly 2 generations ago. One passage in particular caught her breath. If the moon forgets the shape of its own longing, who then will remind it? The words echoed inside her, layering over the anonymous poem she had found. She thought of the dancer from the performance, of the fisherman watching the reflection night after night. She thought of herself, watching, waiting, writing, never quite stepping beyond the painted line of her role. That evening she sat again by the window, her writing box before her. She unfolded fresh paper and dipped her brush in ink. Her movements were slow, measured not by time but by the rhythm of thought. There is no escape, only the choice to remain with eyes still open. She placed the poem beside the one she had found and smoothed them both flat. 2 voices, one known and one unknown, lying side by side. As night fell, the mist thickened outside, cloaking the garden in silver. The lanterns glowed softly in their wooden frames, casting halos of light against the dark. Aoi did not speak. She did not rise. She remained seated long into the night, the poems before her like twin stars, distant, quiet, and unwavering. She did not need to understand everything. Some things she had learned were meant only to be held. The next morning unfolded beneath a sky streaked with colour, the first hints of dawn painted in shades of faded rose and ivory mist. Aoi woke before the light touched her chamber's wooden beams. She sat upright, legs folded beneath her, and listened to the breath of the estate. It was quiet still, as it always was before sunrise, but a subtle shift rode on the air. Spring had crossed some unseen threshold. There was a softness now in the morning air that hadn't been there days before, and the scent of new blossoms had grown stronger, more insistent. From somewhere deep in the garden, a nightingale called, 3 clear notes spaced wide apart, as though the bird itself was unsure whether to believe in the new season. After washing, Aoi stood before her chest of robes, her fingers pausing over the cloths folded within. Today, she reached for one she rarely wore, a shade of pale blossom pink, dyed so delicately it seemed to hold the colour of a single breath. The embroidery was faint, 2 willow branches meeting at the hem, their slender threads shimmering in silver. She wore it slowly, with reverence, and gathered her hair into a loose twist with a single jade pin. The mirror reflected not a lady prepared for ceremony, nor a woman summoned by rank, but someone who had chosen to meet the day as it was, unguarded. No instructions had arrived. No duties called her name. Yet she did not remain in her chamber. Instead, she left her quarters and turned toward the far northeast wing of the estate, where the stone steps led upward to a small, elevated terrace, a place few visited except in times of private reflection. It was bordered by tall hedges and a half-circle of cherry trees, now just beginning to bloom. She had discovered this place years ago when she was still new to the estate and uncertain of its rules. It had become a sanctuary, a breath drawn outside the rhythm of expectation. This morning, the terrace was bathed in quiet light. The first full blossoms were open, wide, pale, trembling slightly with each breeze. Aoi stepped lightly across the stone, mindful not to disturb the petals scattered beneath her feet. She knelt on the low bench and looked out across the rooftops of the estate. their curves slick with dew. Beyond them, the hills stirred with new green, and a thread of river glinted in the valley's throat. This, she thought, is what breath looks like when the world begins again. She remained there for some time, unmoving, allowing the moment to wash over her. Eventually, from her sleeve, she withdrew the folded paper charm she had found the day before. She opened it slowly, reading the lines again. She walks like the wind, not to stir the world around, but to remind it. She traced each character with her eyes, memorizing the curve of the strokes. Then she took out her brush and a scrap of paper from the pouch at her waist and wrote, in answer. And still the petals fall as if she passes near, invisible grace. She folded her reply and placed it within the hollow trunk of the oldest cherry tree on the terrace, where the bark curled back slightly, forming a quiet pocket. Not for discovery, not for certainty, simply for continuity. On her way down, Aoi passed an old servant, one of the senior groundskeepers, his back bent, his hands mottled with age and soil. He paused his sweeping to bow slowly. She returned the gesture, and for a moment their eyes met. There was nothing exchanged, no question, no recognition, but in that brief pause, Aoi felt seen. Not as a role, not as a possession of the estate, but as a person moving gently through her own world. By the time she returned to her chamber, the light had changed. The sun had risen fully, and the courtyard shimmered with warmth. From her window, she could see the girls of the inner quarters hanging lengths of dyed silk to dry in the breeze, their laughter soft, restrained, but not unhappy. She sat before her writing table and opened her lacquered box, where the poems she had written were tucked in careful layers. Today, she did not add another. Instead, she removed one. An older one, written during the height of winter, when the cold had silenced everything but the ache of waiting. She read it again. I am not the snow, but I wear its hush within, where no one can see. She burned it over the flame of her lantern, watching the edges curl into black, then vanish in a slow wisp of smoke. There was no sadness in the act. Some words were meant to live only as long as the feeling they held. Outside, the wind stirred. A few cherry petals floated across the window, catching in the corners of the frame. Aoi rose to catch one in her palm. It trembled there, so light it barely touched her skin. And in that instant, she felt the world open. Not wide, not forever, but just enough to step through. By mid-afternoon, the estate had grown warmer, and the air moved with a kind of golden slowness. The shadows stretched longer now, thin and dappled through the shifting leaves. Aoi walked quietly along the winding garden path, the cherry blossoms in fuller bloom today than they had been the day before. Some had already begun to fall, drifting lazily onto the stones, gathering like faint pink snow. She did not follow her usual route this time. Instead, her steps led her toward the Eastern Library, a quieter part of the estate even than the archives, and one rarely used. It was not a place of official record, nor one meant for ritual. The scrolls here were personal writings, fragments of essays, collections of folk tales, reflections written by those who had once lived behind the estate's veiled walls. Some had names attached, others did not. It was a room of remnants. She entered through the narrow wooden door and paused, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness within. Dust hung suspended in the light that filtered through the tall lattice windows. The scent of old paper and cedar wood rose like a memory from the floor. It was quiet here, quieter even than her chamber, quieter than the rear garden, the kind of quiet that asks for nothing but to be heard. Aoi moved through the shelves, fingertips brushing lightly over the woven cords that bound the scrolls. She chose one at random, its cover worn, the ink faded to a gentle brown. She returned to a low table by the window and opened it slowly. The scroll began with a simple heading, Reflections by a Lady of the Willow Court. No name followed. The writing was delicate and spare, more thoughts than declarations, stitched together like the patterns on a kimono, repeating, folding back, gentle. She read, In this life, we wait not for freedom, but for moments when stillness feels like choosing. I once believed the sky outside these walls belonged to me. Now I see. It is the wind that belongs to no one, and it is enough to feel it pass through my sleeves. Aoi closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle into her. Then she read on. The scroll was not long, but it carried weight. It spoke of the quiet politics between women of different rank, of the way beauty could shield and bind, of friendships born not in joy but in mutual silence. One passage lingered in her mind. The deepest companionship I have known here was with a woman whose name I never learned. We never spoke directly. We left each other poems beneath the garden stones, hidden between pine roots and smooth pebbles. I do not know what became of her, but her words are the ones I remember when the lanterns dim. Aoi rested her hand on the edge of the scroll. Outside the window, the blossoms continued to fall, their rhythm unrushed. It struck her then how many women had lived and vanished within these walls, their names lost, their voices fading. And yet some part of them endured in ink, in the way one brushstroke curved slightly, hesitated, whispered. Each stroke was a reaching hand, extended through time. She returned the scroll to its place with care, bowing her head slightly, as if in thanks. Then she stepped out once more into the garden, her mind still echoing with the voice of the unnamed lady. The wind had picked up slightly, and the scent of plum and cherry mingled in the air. Aoi knelt beneath the old willow by the garden's edge, its branches swaying like strands of hair, and placed her hand upon the earth. It was warm now. The cold had gone. She remained there for a while until a shadow fell across the path. She looked up. A young boy, no older than 10, stood a short distance away, dressed in the plain robes of a page. He held a folded piece of paper in both hands, offered with a hesitant bow. Aoi approached and accepted it silently. The boy bowed again and left without a word. The paper was folded neatly, its edges precise. She opened it slowly, her heart beating with the quiet tension of expectation. Inside was another short verse, written in the same ink as the one she had found before. Among silent stones I wait for the one who hears, who does not look back. She folded the paper again, pressing it softly between her palms. Someone was watching, not cruelly, not to claim or possess, but to understand, to witness. Perhaps to remind her, as the first poem had said, of something she was in danger of forgetting. That night, Aoi wrote no reply. She sat at her window, the folded poem resting on the sill, and watched the moon rise over the edge of the eaves, turning the blossoms to pale fire. In the deep quiet, she whispered aloud, not a poem, not a message, but simply the sound of her own name. She had not said it in many months, not as it had been spoken by her mother, not in the way that belonged only to herself. And in that moment, she remembered, she was still here. Not only as the concubine, the ornament, the still presence by the Lord's side, but as Aoi, a girl who once traced her finger through the mist on a village window pane, a woman who now read the words of ghosts and folded her own into silence. Outside, the wind moved through the garden like a hand brushing hair from a sleeping brow, and Aoi, for the first time in a long while, smiled. The next morning arrived with a silver light, diffused and delicate, as if the sun had chosen to linger behind gauze. The air was cool again, though no longer sharp, and a light mist floated just above the garden paths, softening every edge, every colour, every sound. Aoi moved through her chamber with quiet purpose, not rushed, not drifting, somewhere between the two, like a boat gliding through a still canal. She chose a robe of soft cream, the fabric light and unadorned, save for a single band of embroidery near the collar, clouds stitched in a muted grey thread, barely visible unless one stood close. It was a robe for contemplation, for walking alone, and today that was all she wished for. Her thoughts had not left the poem she received the day before. The words had folded themselves into the corners of her mind, resurfacing at odd moments, not demanding answers, but keeping company. Aoi did not yet know what to make of the one who sent them, if they watched her with affection, with quiet curiosity, or merely with the detachment of a fellow soul adrift in a shared confinement. And yet she felt something in the act itself, that someone within the walls of the estate had seen her, not for the role she performed, but for the quiet she carried, the space she moved within without disturbing. Today she returned to the northeast terrace. The cherry trees there were nearing their full bloom now, and the path had become a tapestry of pink and pale white. Blossoms clung to the edges of stone steps, gathered in the crevices of railings, and drifted lazily across the pond like tiny boats without sails. She climbed the terrace slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the weight of the earth beneath her sandals. At the top, the trees stood in full regalia, their branches arched like the arms of dancers caught mid-turn. A gentle breeze stirred the air, sending petals cascading in slow spirals. Aoi walked to the hollow of the oldest cherry tree, the same one where she had placed her reply days ago. She knelt beside it and reached within, brushing her fingers softly along the bark. There was something there. Another folded paper, smaller this time, wrapped in a piece of linen tied with a thread of crimson. She opened it with care. Inside was not a poem, but a sketch, simple, drawn in black ink on fine rice paper. A single branch of cherry blossom, gently curved, with one blossom falling, its petals just beginning to part. Beneath it, a tiny line of characters. In your stillness, the garden breathes. Aoi exhaled, not loudly, but fully. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the words settle into her chest like warm water. There was something tender in the drawing, an absence of ambition, a lack of ornament. It was the kind of offering that asked nothing in return. She pressed the sketch gently to her chest before folding it again and slipping it into her sleeve. She did not write a reply immediately. Instead, she remained on the terrace for a long while, her gaze on the blossoms, her thoughts unbound. Around her, the petals continued to fall in slow, deliberate silence. When she returned to the main estate, the sun had climbed higher, and the light was more direct. Servants passed her in the corridors, their arms full of clean linens and folded robes for the seasonal change. One of them paused and bowed slightly, her eyes meeting Aoi's for only a breath, but in that breath there was recognition. Something had begun to ripple beneath the calm of her days. That evening, in the hour when the lanterns are first lit and the corridors begin to dim, Aoi prepared her reply, not of words, but of touch. She took a piece of paper and pressed her fingertip into ink, then gently onto the surface, leaving a single print. Beside it, she wrote, "I am not a voice, but if you listen, I stir where the silence grows." She left it folded beneath the bark once more, her hands steady, her expression calm. That night, she did not sit at her writing desk, nor read the old scrolls. She simply lay on her futon with the windows open, the scent of blossoms drifting in. The nightingale sang again, this time not in fragments but in a full and trembling song. And Aoi, though she did not sing, listened with her whole self. A soft rain returned the next morning, not fierce, but steady, each droplet like a drumbeat too gentle to disturb, yet persistent enough to draw the world inward. The blossoms that had begun their fall now rested damp and heavy on the garden stones, some pressed against the wood of the veranda like forgotten letters. The estate, usually quiet, now seemed suspended, the rain cloaking it in a deeper stillness. Aoi listened to it for a long while before rising. She sat beside the window with her knees drawn beneath her robe, watching the rivulets of water trace slow paths down the screen. The scent of wet wood, of soaked earth and early petals drifted in. Her robe today was of soft brown silk, the colour of tea leaves steeped long, with a faint border of deep green pine needles. The jade pin in her hair remained, though today it was nestled lower, looser, allowing her hair to fall more freely down her back. She had not planned to walk in the garden, but the rain, constant and rhythmic, called to her, not for exploration, but for a kind of companionship. She wrapped a thin outer robe over her shoulders and stepped out beneath the eaves. The garden was empty, save for the occasional flash of a servant's form in the distance. No one lingered in the rain unless necessity called, yet Aoi moved slowly along the covered walkway, pausing where the eaves extended just enough to allow her to look out over the mist-covered pond. The water's surface was alive with rain, the ripples overlapping in quiet conversation. The trees around the garden bent slightly under the weight of moisture, their branches shimmering with thousands of tiny beads. She watched one blossom, still clinging to a branch, sway and then finally release, drifting downward in slow surrender. She thought of the poem she had left the day before, of the ink-stained fingerprint, of the silence that waited patiently for answers. Then, almost without thought, her steps turned again toward the terrace. The path was wet, but she did not mind. Each footfall was measured, softened by the rain. As she climbed the final stone steps to the top, she saw it immediately, beneath the gnarled cherry tree, resting exactly where her last note had been left. A small, flat stone. Upon its surface, carefully protected beneath a layer of waxed paper, was a verse, handwritten in the same ink as before. "The silence you stir lives between the falling drops. not to be broken. There was no signature, no name, but it was an answer, not merely a reply, but a recognition, an agreement, almost, between two souls who had decided not to speak, yet still found ways to say what mattered. Aoi remained there in the rain, reading the lines again and again. She did not retreat beneath the eaves. Instead, she stepped forward into the rain and let the drops soak into her sleeves and hair. The cold ran down her skin, but it was not unpleasant. It awakened her, not in a jarring way, but as if the world were gently shaking her shoulder, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something so delicate it could only be held in silence. She raised her face to the sky and closed her eyes. It felt as though the rain could read her thoughts. That afternoon, she returned to her chamber and changed into dry robes. The warmth of the inner room wrapped around her like a second skin, and she moved more slowly, as if something within had shifted. She sat again before her writing table, though no brush touched the paper. Instead, she opened a new box, a small one she had kept hidden among her personal belongings. Within it were scraps of silk, pieces of thread, tiny charms from her childhood, objects without use, yet filled with memory. She chose a strip of dark indigo silk and folded it carefully, wrapping it around a small square of parchment on which she had written a line, just one. "If I vanish, let it be into rain." She wrapped it like a talisman, tied it with a single black thread, and tucked it into the same hollow beneath the tree the next morning, when the rain had ceased and the mist still blanketed the ground like breath not yet exhaled. She left no name, only the shape of her own breath, only the echo of her stillness, entrusted to someone who had chosen not to break it. The day unfolded with the hush that always followed a night of rain. The world, freshly rinsed, carried the scent of stone and moss, as though all the old dust of winter had been gently swept away. The cherry blossoms were now at their fullest, fragile clouds poised at the edge of surrender, and the ground beneath them was soft with fallen petals that clung to every surface like faint, remembered dreams. Aoi moved slowly through the veranda that skirted her chamber, her eyes half lowered, watching the motion of wind against leaf. The estate was quieter than usual. The rain had subdued not just the garden, but the very spirit of the household. Even the bells from the western hall were more subdued, their chimes softened by the wet wood and misty air. She did not expect a message that day. She had left her reply, a poem wrapped in silk bound in silence, and expected it might vanish as so many things did within the estate. Perhaps the one who sent the earlier verses would not return. Perhaps the ritual had ended, quietly as it had begun. But when she returned to the terrace just before noon, drawn by nothing more than instinct and the hush of wind among branches, she found something waiting beneath the cherry tree. Not paper, not ink, a small lacquered comb. It was simple, not ornate like those reserved for court ceremonies. Made from dark wood, it bore no jewels, no gilding. Just a thin, hand-carved pattern of waves along one edge, the kind of object meant to be used, not displayed. Alongside it, a strip of parchment folded precisely. Aoi opened it slowly. For the hair that holds the scent of falling seasons and does not forget. She sat beside the tree for a long time, her hands resting on the comb. There was something intimate in the gesture, not forward, not bold, but deeply personal. A gift not of admiration, but of recognition. To offer something for another's hair was to acknowledge presence, texture, breath. It was to say, "I see the parts of you you think invisible." Aoi brushed her fingers along the wood's surface. It had been oiled, cared for. This was not something taken up lightly or given in passing. Later in her chamber, she sat before the small bronze mirror and slowly untied the jade pin from her hair. She held the comb, felt its weight, and then drew it through the dark strands with slow, even strokes. Her reflection shimmered in the dim afternoon light, not sharp, not fully there, like a shadow beneath water. Yet the act itself anchored her, as if the gift had made her real in some quiet way. That evening she composed no verse. She wrote no reply. Instead, she took a thin cord of white silk and attached it to the comb, then hung it near her window, where the wind could pass over it, move it gently and stir the air around it. A presence held there, not spoken, not written, just kept. The silence of that night was unlike the others, not empty, not expectant, It felt full, as if something had arrived, not in words or gestures, but in the soft exchange of breath through wooden corridors. She lay down without lighting the lantern. In the dark, the comb stirred softly, clicking against the window frame, a sound barely heard, yet enough to remind her that someone had reached across the great hush, not with force, but with care. And she, without knowing when it began, had reached back. The following morning unfolded in golden quiet, the light rich and warm across the rooftops of the estate. It had the texture of silk left in sunlight, soft, radiant, and slow to wrinkle. From her window, Aoi could see the garden glowing faintly, dew evaporating from the petals like breath, leaving sleeping mouths. The cherry blossoms, now at their peak, were caught in a moment so brief and exquisite that it seemed almost cruel to witness their perfection, knowing it would soon pass. She dressed in a robe of pale blue-grey, the colour of the sky just before dawn, with delicate threadwork at the collar in the shape of cranes mid-flight. Her hair was left loosely gathered, but she used the comb, the one she had received the day before. As she drew it through her hair, she moved slowly, not to delay, but to remain fully present. The weight of it in her hand felt like a promise, not loud, not demanding, just quietly there. She had nothing written to return. No poem today. Yet her hands reached for paper as if by habit, and her brush hovered above the blank page for a long time before she set it down again. Some feelings did not fit neatly into ink. Some belonged to stillness. Instead, she walked. The garden, washed in morning light, felt changed, though perhaps it was she who had changed. Every leaf, every petal seemed to shimmer with new detail. She traced the path slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of a hedge, her steps aligning to the quiet rhythm of falling blossoms. At the corner where the garden turned toward the smaller courtyard, she noticed something that had not been there before. A strip of cloth, blue silk, nearly the same shade as her robe, tied to a low branch of the cherry tree. It danced lightly in the breeze. Attached to it was another folded note, and beneath the silk, something glinted faintly. She untied it gently. The note was brief. You are not seen in the way others would claim, but in the way light enters a room and changes the shape of shadow. Folded within the silk was a single silver bell, small enough to rest in her palm, with a tone so faint it did not ring unless stirred by the gentlest motion. Aoi held it against her cheek. She did not cry, but the sensation rose in her, unexpected, wordless, like mist lifting from a pond. Not sorrow, not longing, just the ache of being held, even from afar. She carried the bell with her as she returned to her room, placing it on the sill beside the comb. The wind came and touched it once, and it gave the faintest sound, like a memory remembered just in time. Later that afternoon, she returned to the tree where the note had been left. This time, she brought no poem. Instead, she brought an old hair ribbon from her youth, a faded strip of deep maroon that her mother had tied for her on the morning she left the village. She hadn't worn it in years. But today she tied it carefully to the branch, just below where the silk had been, letting it hang freely in the breeze. No words, no names, just presence. As evening fell, the sky bloomed into colours too soft to name, hints of lilac, peach, and pearl. Aoi watched the light shift along the veranda, watched how the shadows curved and softened, how the petals danced in eddies of wind and fell into still water. She thought then of her name, not the one given to her in the estate, but the one her mother whispered into her ear on stormy nights when she had been too young to know the weight of the world. That name had not been spoken in years. She mouthed it now, silently, without sound, feeling it take shape again inside her chest. The bell stirred once more in the window's breeze, and in the hush that followed, Aoi smiled, not for herself alone, but for the invisible thread now weaving quietly between her and someone she had not yet seen. Someone who, like her, knew how to speak in the language of stillness. That night, the wind arrived like a whispering guest, unexpected, restless, brushing through the corridors of the estate and slipping into chambers through the slats and seams of wood and paper. The lanterns swayed on their hooks, casting long, gentle shadows that quivered across the floor. Aoi lay beneath her futon, not yet asleep, the blanket drawn lightly over her as she listened to the creaking wood and the hush of moving air. She was not uneasy, but the feeling was unfamiliar. The wind seldom came so boldly in spring. The silver bell at her window stirred more frequently now, its chime soft, almost apologetic. It did not sing, but it breathed, its sound a barely-there murmur that echoed in the quiet corners of her mind. The comb rested beside it, unmoved. The ribbon she had left beneath the cherry tree had likely fluttered through the night, perhaps even now slipping loose, joining the fallen blossoms in the damp soil. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it came with dreams, fragmented images without a clear path. A narrow stream winding between tall reeds, a pair of hands, one resting atop the other, in silence. A screen door sliding open to reveal nothing but mist. She awoke before dawn, the dream still clinging to the edges of her thoughts, but already slipping from memory like ink dissolving in water. She did not rise immediately. Instead, she lay listening to the earliest birds stir in the trees, their calls tentative. The sky outside her window had not yet begun to brighten. All was still layered in blue. When she finally stepped into the garden just past sunrise, the air was cool, touched by the breath of the night wind still lingering in shaded corners. The cherry blossoms were beginning to thin. More petals lay on the ground now than clung to the branches above. The trees had entered the stage of gentle surrender. She walked with careful steps, not to disturb the petals beneath her feet. Her robe was of soft lavender today, nearly grey in low light, with pale patterns of river grass and moonstone embroidered along the sleeves. Her hair was loose, caught only at the nape with a single cord of white silk. Her feet led her again, without command or plan, to the terrace where so many silent exchanges had passed. She half expected nothing to be there. After all, what more could be said? The bell, the comb, the poem, each had been a word in a language that needed no grammar. Perhaps the silence would now resume, enriched but undisturbed. And yet, tucked delicately against the root of the tree, she found something small and wrapped in parchment. No ribbon, no seal. Just folded paper held in place by a pebble smooth as river glass. She lifted it gently, unfolding the parchment to reveal a passage, not a poem this time, but a sentence written in a firm but elegant hand. Do you believe there is a world where we might speak, not with silence, but with voice? Aui's breath caught. The air around her seemed to shift. For a moment, the garden blurred as if her senses had leaned too far into that single line. It was not a question meant for reply, or perhaps it was. It was also an invitation. She returned to her chamber, moving more slowly than usual. There was a weight now. Not a burden, but the presence of something that might soon ask to step from shadow into light. All day, her thoughts circled the question. She tended to her small duties. She helped organize a delivery of seasonal fabrics for the inner quarters. She shared tea with one of the elder concubines, listening as the woman spoke of her youth in a distant northern province. Aoi smiled, nodded, offered quiet laughter where it was needed, but the parchment never left her mind, nor the feeling it stirred. That evening, as dusk began to tint the sky in faint pinks and silvers, Aoi sat at her writing desk and unrolled a clean sheet of paper. She lit the lantern, she dipped her brush, and she wrote. Not a poem, not a reply, but a reflection. A truth she had not spoken, even to herself. I do not know that world, but I have begun to dream of it. In my dreams, there is no need to bow before speaking, no gate between thought and voice. In that world, the silence is still sacred, but it is chosen, not given, and sometimes it is broken gently, by the sound of someone calling my name not because they must, but because they wish to. She read it twice. Then she folded it with the same care she gave to the brushing of her hair. She tied it with a ribbon of ash-grey silk, plain, soft, the colour of twilight. She did not place it in the hollow tree. Instead, she tucked it beneath the edge of a stone near the base, where moss grew in patches and petals gathered like secrets. That night, she did not wait by the window. She did not reach for her brush again, or search the shadows for the bell's faint chime. Instead, she lay down with her face turned toward the garden and let her thoughts drift not into dreams, but into stillness. And in that stillness, there was no fear. Only the sense that something was shifting slowly, respectfully, like the first tilt of the moon toward fullness. When she closed her eyes, she whispered her name once more, and for the first time she imagined saying it aloud, not to the wind, not to the mirror, but to someone who might answer it in return. The sun rose slowly the next morning, veiled behind a thin curtain of spring mist. It cast no hard shadows, no sharp beams, only a gentle light that spread across the estate like a sigh. The garden shimmered with dew once more, each blade of grass crowned with silver droplets, while the last of the cherry blossoms clung delicately to their branches, reluctant to fall. Aoi stirred from her futon before the bell sounded, her body already awake, guided not by obligation, but by the quiet urgency of something unknown. There was no sound but the faint hush of distant birdsong and the soft shift of the screens as the breeze moved gently through the wooden frame of her chamber. She washed without ceremony, tying her hair back with a simple cord. The comb, his gift, remained on the sill, but today she did not touch it. Her fingers lingered above it for only a moment before she turned to choose her robe. She selected one of the softest, plain white with a lining the colour of faint rose, like the underbelly of a cloud at dusk. It was a robe that held no season, no proclamation, only stillness. She stepped into the garden barefoot, her sandals left by the door. The stone beneath her feet was cool, but not unkind, and the air carried the scent of moss and fallen petals. She did not walk toward the terrace, nor to the usual paths that wound around the main pond. Instead, her feet led her inward, toward the lesser-used servants' corridors, narrow walkways and shaded alleys where few of the concubines ventured. The estate had always had corners meant to be forgotten, places too small, too inconvenient, too quiet to be of importance. But it was in these quiet corners that Aoi felt the presence of something ancient. The past breathed here, tucked into the folds of damp stone and wood darkened with age. She paused beside a low stone wall near the eastern kitchen yard, where ivy had begun to climb and where a single leafless tree stood watching, as if it had once guarded something long gone. She placed her hand on the stone, pressing her fingers gently into its cool, rough surface. She did not know why she was drawn here, only that the air around her pulsed with something quiet and living. It was not a message. It was not a sign, but it felt like the moment before a voice speaks, when the silence has gathered breath. She remained there until a soft footfall behind her stirred her from thought. She turned slowly, expecting to see a servant, or perhaps another woman passing by, but it was not either. He was younger than she had imagined, not a boy, but not quite old either. His robes were simple, undyed linen tied at the waist, and he carried a shallow basket of moss and petals in one hand, as if he had been gathering them for some quiet task. His expression, when he met her eyes, was not surprised, not expectant, just gentle. They did not speak at first. The wind moved between them, brushing against her robe, teasing the corner of the parchment still tucked into her sleeve. The bell at her window had not rung that morning, but now in her chest she felt its echo. He bowed, not deeply, but enough to mark respect, not just to her place in the estate, but to her presence, to her choosing to be there in that moment. Aoi inclined her head slightly in return. Her fingers closed softly over the edge of her sleeve. "I thought," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, "that I might never be near enough to say anything at all." His voice was not remarkable, but it held a rhythm that she recognized. It was the rhythm of the poems. The shape of the silences between his words matched the ones she had learned to live within. "You have been near," she replied, her voice soft, the words barely above the breeze, even without sound. He nodded. "I left no name, not out of fear, but out of respect." "I never asked for one," she said, "because the not knowing became part of the knowing." They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by the hush of ivy and wind. Around them, the estate continued its day. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors, the clatter of bowls from the kitchens, the soft murmur of water drawn from a cistern, yet none of it touched them here. He stepped forward slowly and placed the basket of gathered petals on the stone beside the tree. "For you," he said, "though I know you have already held more beauty than these could offer." Aoi looked down at the petals. Some were from the last of the plum trees, others from wildflowers that grew near the outer wall. They were not perfect. Some had curled edges, some had faded. But together they held something honest. "I will keep them," she said, "not for what they are, but for the hand that gathered them." There was no need to say more. She stepped back, giving him space, and bowed slightly, not the bow of a concubine to a servant, not of status to station, but of self to self. Then she turned and walked away. Her feet moved slowly, yet each step was certain. She did not glance back, because she did not need to. What had passed between them would not vanish with distance. It had entered the space between their lives, soft as breath, real as silence. Back in her chamber, she placed the basket by her window. She did not write that day. Instead, she untied her robe, combed her hair slowly, and lay down beneath the open screen. Outside, the last of the cherry blossoms fell in spirals. And Aoi, though she spoke no words aloud, whispered one truth into the air with every breath she took. She had been found, not taken, not called, not chosen, found. The light of morning came with clarity, the kind of clean, unfiltered light that appears only after many days of haze or shadow. It passed through the slats of Aoi's window like a soft invitation, illuminating her chamber in strips of pale gold. Outside, the blossoms had thinned to a few stubborn clusters clinging to the tips of branches. The garden was quieter now, emptied of the flush of colour that had made it feel dreamlike in days past. She sat on the veranda with her knees drawn beneath her robe, the silver bell and wooden comb placed beside her as always. The basket of gathered petals rested nearby, still fragrant, though some had begun to curl at the edges. It had been 3 days since she had seen him in the hidden corner of the eastern walkways, 3 days in which they had exchanged no messages, no notes, no gifts. And yet something between them had shifted. They had passed each other once since, near the water basins by the corridor that bordered the rear gardens. He had been carrying a stack of fresh tatami mats. She, returning from the shrine path. Their eyes had met, and though no bow was exchanged, the silence between them pulsed with quiet recognition. It was not a relationship, not even yet a connection in the way others might name it. It was an understanding, a space that had opened between their silences. That morning, as she rose to brush her hair, she reached again for the comb. As she drew it slowly through the strands, her mind drifted, not to him directly, but to the way the world had begun to feel since the exchange began. It was not romantic, not in the way poems described. It was something simpler, softer, like wind across still water, a knowing without demand. After breakfast, taken in solitude with a bowl of miso and 2 slices of pickled radish, she wandered the garden paths, gathering loose threads of fallen bark and petal. The season was shifting now. She could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the garden no longer clung to each bloom, but offered them freely to the earth. At the southern edge of the estate, past the main bathhouse and through a corridor few past, there was a small wooden structure that once housed scroll copyists. It had long been abandoned as more official archives were established elsewhere. Its screens hung loosely on their rails and the paper had faded from ivory to a warm beige speckled by the years. Aoi pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. Dust floated in slanted rays of sun. A few empty shelves remained, a cracked water basin in the corner, and an old writing desk with one leg slightly warped. Yet the air was still, peaceful. She knelt by the desk and ran her hand over the surface. There were small grooves, left behind by pressure from thousands of brush strokes, the marks of names and thoughts now lost to time. It was a forgotten place, yes, but it had once held voices. She could feel that. With slow movements, she unwrapped a piece of parchment from within her sleeve and set it on the desk. It was a new poem, not written for anyone, not left to be found, just something that had grown inside her and needed a shape. The voice of the wind does not ask to be answered, only to be heard. She did not fold it. She left it there, lying in the light, content to let it fade into the room like breath in winter. Some words were not meant to last, only to be given. When she returned to her chamber later that day, a change awaited her. On the window ledge beside the bell and the comb, a sprig of green had been left. Not a flower, not even a blossom, just a cutting from a tea shrub, its leaves newly budded, still soft to the touch. There was no note, no name, but she knew. In the simplest language of their shared silence, he had spoken again. Aoi lifted the sprig gently and brought it to her nose. The scent was fresh, green and faintly bitter, like the earliest flush of leaves in spring before the sun had fully warmed them. It reminded her of quiet mornings in her mother's garden, when dew still clung to everything and the day had not made its demands. She did not reply that night. Instead, she brewed tea from her own small pouch of leaves, more mature than his, darker, and drank it seated by the open screen, letting the steam curl around her face. She thought of him then. Not in any detailed form. She still did not know his full name, nor what hours he worked beyond those brief glimpses, but she knew his rhythm. She knew his silences. And she knew that somewhere in the quiet corners of the estate, he too might be sitting near an open window, holding something left behind by her hand. That night her dreams were not of gardens or mist. They were of sound, not music, not voices, but the soft fall of footsteps beside her own, the breath of someone pausing before words, the subtle shift of robes against tatami, the sounds of company, not announced, not formal, just present. When she awoke, she sat for a long time in the fading shadow of her dream, then walked barefoot across the room and knelt by the comb. She whispered not a poem, but a thought aloud to no one. I am learning how to be seen. The bell did not ring, the wind did not stir, but the silence answered her, as it always did, with space, with stillness, with the promise of another quiet step forward. The days turned warmer in a slow and deliberate way, as though spring were drawing its breath deeper, before exhaling into the full greenness of early summer. The blossoms were nearly gone now, their petals thinned to sparse clusters and scatterings on the pond's surface. What had once floated like confetti on the wind now settled in corners, pressed into the damp earth, returning without fuss to the soil that bore them. Aoi had begun to feel the quiet pull of the season's change deep within her bones, not with sadness, but with the soft ache that comes from knowing something gentle has nearly passed. There was a sweetness in that ache, a gratitude for having noticed the fleeting beauty at all. It was the kind of feeling she could not explain, even to herself. She spent more time alone now, but not out of isolation. Her solitude was no longer a thing that pressed against her chest, but something she stepped into with calm reverence, like slipping into a warm bath or walking barefoot through dew-covered grass. And yet, even within that quiet, she was aware of a presence, not close, not watching, but echoing. As though somewhere in the estate's folded layers of stone and corridor and wind-washed eaves, someone was also listening. She had not seen him since the day of the tea sprig, but in that absence she had not felt lost. She believed, quietly, that they were still walking near one another, sometimes passing in the same space, sometimes not. There was no plan, no pattern, just a rhythm they had begun to follow without needing to agree upon it. That morning, she woke before dawn, drawn not by noise or thought, but by something more inward, a restlessness that carried no name. She dressed in the soft light of the sky before sun, donning a robe of unmarked indigo with the faintest hem of cream thread. She brushed her hair loose, let it fall without ornament, and stepped into the garden as though entering a sacred place. The sky above was painted in layers of pale blue and pearl grey, the last stars dimming one by one. The pond reflected nothing yet, only the shape of dawn's intention. The garden itself seemed to hold its breath. She walked without direction, her feet guiding her toward the western grove, a quiet space near the edge of the estate where the stone lanterns were older, moss-covered and crooked with age. Few others came this way, except the occasional gardener or the elder servant who swept the outer path. And there, upon the low bench beneath a gnarled pine tree, she found it. A small wooden tablet, ima, the kind used in temples for prayers and wishes. It had been tied with twine to the backrest of the bench, simple and unadorned, its surface smooth from a careful hand. Upon it, written in a narrow, practiced brushstroke, was a single phrase: "When this season ends, may what has begun remain." Aoi stood still for a long time, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the tablet, the other folded within her sleeve. She did not touch it, did not untie it. To take it would be to close something. To leave it was to acknowledge it had already entered her heart. Her chest swelled with something like breath, but deeper. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way that others would recognize, but closeness. A nearness that had grown not through shared days or spoken confessions, but through presence, through attention, through the language of quiet exchange. She bowed to the bench, a silent offering of thanks, and walked slowly back to her chamber. That evening she prepared tea with unusual care, selecting a small ceramic cup she had not used since her arrival years before. It had been a gift from a senior attendant, plain but subtly curved, the glaze uneven in a way that made it feel alive in the hand. She filled it with freshly steeped tea, not the darker leaves, but a younger blend, soft and bright with the scent of new grass and morning rain. She did not drink it. Instead, she placed it on the outer ledge of her window just beside the bell and comb and let it sit in the moonlight. There was no need to mark it. No note. No offering. No response. It was not meant to be found. It was simply meant to be, to exist for a while in the open, to steep in light and silence and wind, like a thought unspoken but felt, like a gesture made not towards someone, but into the space between two lives. That night, Aoi dreamt again, not of voices or faces, but of hands. One hand reaching, one hand resting, not touching, not yet, but not afraid. When she awoke, the cup was still there. The tea had cooled. A single petal had fallen into it, floating like a boat upon still waters. She did not remove it. She did not move the cup. Instead, she stepped back from the window, wrapped her robe more tightly around herself, and sat quietly as the morning bell rang in the courtyard. She did not need an answer. The gesture had already become its own. The following day unfurled slowly, its light golden and forgiving, the kind that softened even the most angular corners of the estate. Aoi moved through it with unhurried steps, each motion carried out with the quiet grace that had become as natural to her as breath. She did not yet know what had settled in her chest, this calm weight, this tether to something unseen, but she welcomed it. She passed through the inner gardens with a basket tucked gently in the crook of her arm, gathering fallen petals, smooth pebbles, and fresh leaves for a new incense blend she had begun to create. It was not an assigned task, simply a practice she had taken upon herself in the way that some women learned the flute or embroidery. For her, it was the scent of memory she shaped, soft smoke curling in stillness, a way to bring form to feeling. The bell from the central hall rang once, marking the hour before late meal. A few other women passed her on the path, their voices hushed in conversation. One of them smiled at her in greeting, a slight tilt of the head. Aoi returned it, her own expression serene, unreadable. Not out of coldness, but out of protection. She had learned how to keep her inner world whole. Later, in her chamber, she crushed the gathered petals with a stone pestle, mixing them with cedar shavings and a pinch of powdered plum. The scent rose slowly, first green, then sweet, then warm with the memory of fire. She placed the mixture in a small clay dish and lit it carefully. Smoke drifted upward, dancing lazily beneath the rafters, curling toward the corners of the room like a cat seeking warmth. She sat beside it with her eyes half lowered, watching its trails vanish one by one. That evening, she did not go to the terrace or the western grove. She remained within the hush of her own space, trusting that if he had meant to speak again, the gesture would come in time. And if it did not, the stillness would be enough. But just as the light faded and the sky shifted to lavender, a quiet knock came at the outer screen door. It was not loud, barely a sound at all. Not the rap of duty, nor the knock of announcement. It was almost hesitant, almost like a question spoken not with voice but with presence. Aoi stood slowly and moved to the screen. On the step lay a folded cloth. Not a scroll, not a letter, just a simple square of woven flax, its edge embroidered with a single character. Listen. She knelt to pick it up, then unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small paper fan, hand-painted in faded watercolours. It was not a court fan, no gold, no lacquer, no intricate patterning. Just a scene of mountain fog rising between pine trees, with two cranes drawn in soft strokes flying in opposite directions. In the corner, a single ink mark, his again, no name, no title. The meaning was not obvious, but it settled into her like tea into porcelain. She placed the fan on her writing table and sat before it. For a long time she said nothing, wrote nothing, just watched. There was something in the cranes, one moving north, one south. And yet they shared the same sky, the same wind, the same breath of rising mist. After a time, she wrote, "We move differently but are shaped by the same wind. I am listening." She folded it into a small triangle and tied it with the thinnest thread of pale green silk. She did not leave it beneath the tree, nor place it near the old bench. Instead, she tucked it into the seam of the door frame near the rear corridor, the place where she had first seen him passing with the tatami mats. A place of motion, of transition. a threshold, and then she waited, not in the sense of expecting, but in the sense of remaining open. The next morning passed without sign. But in the early afternoon, as she returned from the east courtyard, something caught her attention on the edge of her chamber window. Just beneath the sill, a single twig had been placed, carefully balanced across the wood, tied to it a red string, and upon the string a tiny shell, the kind found by riversides and shallow lakes. Inside the shell a curled piece of parchment, no longer than her smallest finger. She unrolled it gently. To move with the wind but never lose your stillness, this is how you fly. Aoi held the shell in her palm, and for a moment she closed her fingers around it. She did not smile, not outwardly, but her breath deepened and the silence within her felt fuller than before. She placed the shell beside the bell, and that night, as she prepared to sleep, she looked once more at the fan, 2 cranes, 1 sky, no map, only flight. The following morning was gentle, its air touched by the breath of distant rain that had not yet arrived. The sky wore a soft veil of grey, and though the sun rose behind it, the light was diffused, quiet, like a secret between the clouds and the garden below. The wind had stilled. Even the bell at Aoi's window remained silent, as though the world itself was pausing in reverence. She moved through the motions of waking not with routine, but with intent. Her robe was the soft green of spring moss, simple but finely woven, its weight comforting. Her hair, damp from the early wash, fell loosely across her back, unadorned. She left her chamber with no particular aim, walking barefoot through the quieter corridors, her steps soundless on the polished wood. There was a stillness in her, not empty, but composed. A kind of knowing had begun to settle, unspoken, unclaimed, but steady. She felt it in the way her breath moved, in the calm between her thoughts. Not joy, not yearning, but something truer. She had not written since the fan arrived, had not left any more replies. There was no need. Each exchange now lingered, not as something unfinished, but as something unfolding. Her feet brought her to the east veranda, where the garden sloped slightly toward the outer wall. From here she could see the hills beyond the estate, softened by the morning's haze. A narrow path curved through a grove of flowering shrubs, leading to the smallest of the estate's gates, rarely used, quietly watched. She stood there, just past the final step of the veranda, gazing at the horizon. The season had begun to shift, not in grand gestures, but in the subtlest ways, the deepening of green in the leaves, the first hum of cicadas not yet singing, the way the air tasted faintly of water and clay. The cherry trees were nearly bare now, their limbs growing darker and more exposed, as if resting after their brief rain. A movement caught her eye. Beneath the older pine near the base of the path, a figure knelt, gathering fallen twigs into a low pile beside a stone basin. His motions were patient, precise. She recognized him from the shape of his shoulders, the angle of his head as he leaned forward. He did not look up, but something in his body shifted as she approached, as though he knew she was there before her shadow touched the ground. She stopped a few steps away. He stood slowly and turned to face her. There was no surprise in his expression, only calm, a trace of something between invitation and understanding. They bowed to one another. No words were spoken. After a moment, she stepped closer. The pile of twigs he had gathered was modest, arranged with care. He gestured toward it, then toward the basin. At first, she did not understand. But then she saw, within the basin, a small circle of coals faintly smouldering, shielded from the breeze by a ring of stone. He was building a fire, not for heat, but for scent, for offering. He held out a small pouch. Aoi accepted it. Inside were shavings of wood and finely ground petals, her incense, or something like it. A blend she recognized as familiar, yet altered, softened. He knelt beside the fire, and she joined him. Together, without words, they fed the wood into the basin, layering it gently. The smoke rose slowly, curling upward in pale streams, fragrant and unhurried. It carried the scent of plum and pine, with a hint of cedar and the faintest note of dried mandarin peel. They sat side by side as the smoke lifted around them, not touching, not turning to look, simply existing together in the curl of shared stillness. The silence between them was not absence. It was language. After a time, he reached into his sleeve and brought out a piece of paper, creased gently, edges worn from having been carried. He did not hand it to her, but placed it on the ground between them. Then he rose. She looked at him. Their eyes met for the first time without hesitation. He bowed once, slowly, deeply, and then walked away down the path, his steps light, steady, never once glancing back. She remained seated for a moment longer before reaching for the paper. It bore only a few lines, written in a hand she now recognized by the way the strokes curved just slightly at their ends. Some winds do not pass, they become part of the trees. If you listen, you will always hear that I was here. Aoi folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. The smoke still rose beside her, trailing skyward. She closed her eyes and breathed it in, letting it fill her lungs, her thoughts, the quiet within her bones. She did not chase him, did not follow. What had been shared was not meant to be held with hands. It was not possession, it was not promise, it was presence. And that was enough. The sun was high when Aoi finally returned to her chamber, its rays filtering through the lattice with the kind of light that revealed dust in the air and warmed the floors beneath her feet. Her sandals lay untouched beside the door. She had walked the path barefoot, the earth still cool where it had been shaded by stone walls and bowed pine trees. Her skin held the memory of the incense smoke. Her sleeves carried the scent of ash and blossom. The folded paper remained in her hand. She had not placed it with the others, not yet. Instead, she laid it gently on the windowsill beside the comb, the bell, and the small shell tied with red string. Together, they made no shrine, no altar, just a quiet constellation of moments, a map of what had passed between them. She did not feel abandoned, nor did she feel content in the ordinary sense of the word. What rested in her chest was something more balanced, a peace tinged with ache, a silence that hummed with memory. He had walked away, yes, but not to disappear. Rather, to honour the space they had made. And she, in return, had remained still, not to wait, but to listen. That afternoon, as the courtyard fell into a soft lull, she opened her writing box. There was no need for formality now. She did not prepare her ink with the same deliberate grace. Her hand moved as if remembering something ancient, a rhythm older than letters. The brush met the paper with fluid confidence. She wrote, "There are paths we do not walk together, but still they echo with our footsteps. The wind carries your voice not as a whisper, but as a warmth in places no one else notices." She folded the paper and placed it not with the others, but inside the sleeve of her robe. Close to her, quiet, a secret only the fabric would feel. That evening, the estate was unusually hushed. Perhaps it was the weight of the heat pressing down on the rooftops. Perhaps it was the absence of blossoms on the breeze. Or perhaps it was simply that something had passed through the walls, something unseen, like a story told only in glances. The other women moved through the halls as usual, their steps soft, their gestures practiced. But there was a pause in the way some of them turned their heads, a flicker in their eyes, as though they too sensed that something had shifted, something had been released. Aoi did not join them for the evening meal. Instead, she poured herself a bowl of barley tea and carried it to the veranda. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the stone paths. She watched as a single crane flew across the sky, its wings slow and heavy, its flight smooth and undisturbed. She remembered the fan. Rising, she went to her desk and unwrapped it once more. The two cranes, painted in soft ink, one flying north, the other south. Not touching, but not separate. She had misunderstood their direction. They were not leaving one another. They were circling, always part of the same sky. She brought the fan to her lap and opened it with care. In the last light of the sun, it glowed softly, the painted mist taking on depth, as though the birds might slip from the paper and continue their path above the rooftops. As night fell, the sound of the bell outside her window stirred once, just once, as the wind returned, faint but real. She did not move to light a candle. Darkness gathered slowly, not heavy but kind, wrapping around her like a robe left out under the stars. She lay down with the fan resting beside her, its wooden spine cool against her hand. Her final thought before sleep was not a memory. It was a wordless sense of being held, not by him, but by everything they had shaped together. By silence, by scent, by the way a message left in stillness could become a home in someone else's breath. The dream that came to her that night was quiet and slow. She walked beside a river, its banks lined with plum trees no longer in bloom. She wore no shoes. The earth was soft. Ahead of her the path turned, but she did not hurry. The river flowed beside her. The sky above held no cranes, no fan, just clouds that shifted like folded silk, brushed by an unseen wind. When she woke, the bell was still. The fan lay beside her, and her hands were open. The days grew longer. The heat came slowly at first, creeping through the narrow corridors and across the stones of the courtyard, until the shadows fled to the very corners of the estate. The garden transformed, not with sudden bloom, but with a settling, a deepening of colour and scent. The greens were richer, the bark darker, the sky above vast and pale with early summer's quiet promise. Aoi adjusted to the change without protest. Her robes became lighter, her sleeves looser. She rose earlier, before the sun could make the floors beneath her bare feet too warm. Her movements remained gentle, though there was now a rhythm to them that had not been there before. She no longer lingered in uncertainty. There was no waiting, no searching. Something had completed its circle within her. She began to spend her mornings in the far corner of the garden, beneath the wide-leafed maple where the moss grew thick and the breeze passed more freely. It was a quiet space, not entirely hidden, but far enough from the walkways that only those seeking silence found their way there. She brought with her a small bundle each time, a clay bowl, her writing brush, and a square of paper. Sometimes she wrote, sometimes she did not. The others noticed the change. There were glances, quiet words passed between fans, though none spoken to her directly. But they sensed it. Perhaps they thought she had been summoned more frequently, or that the Lord had favoured her. But it was not that. Aoi had not seen the Lord in many days. She no longer measured her place by the number of his requests or the richness of her robes. Her worth had begun to root elsewhere, and the stillness she had cultivated all this time no longer felt like waiting. It felt like presence. One morning, as she sat beneath the maple with her tea, she noticed a shadow approach, slow, hesitant. Not a servant, not another concubine, but the elder matron, Lady Morika, who rarely ventured beyond her shaded quarters except to oversee formal gatherings or to deliver the Lord's instructions. Aoi rose respectfully and bowed, expecting a brief word or question, but Lady Morika only motioned for her to sit. Without a sound, the older woman lowered herself onto the stone beside Aoi and rested her hands in her lap. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her robes bore the subtle weight of a higher rank, though worn with the humility of one who understood the quiet dignity of age. For a while they sat without speaking. Then softly, the matron said, "You have changed." Aoi did not answer at first. "I think I have remembered," she replied at last, her voice low, "something I forgot when I first arrived." "And what was that?" "How to belong to myself." Lady Morika nodded slowly. "That is not something many here learn, or if they do, it takes much longer than it took you." They sat together as the wind stirred the maple leaves above them, dappling their robes with shifting light. "When I was your age," the matron continued, "I thought silence meant obedience. That stillness was something given to us, not something we chose. But watching you these past months, I have begun to wonder." Aoi turned her head slightly, meeting the older woman's gaze. "You have reminded us," Lady Morika said, "that grace does not mean disappearing." Aoi bowed her head, not in humility, but in gratitude. The matron rose then, slowly but surely, and walked back along the path, leaving Aoi in the rustle of leaves and the hush of morning. That evening, as twilight gathered in soft folds across the rooftops, Aoi returned to her chamber. She did not light a lantern. The natural dimness of dusk was enough. She opened the lacquered box where her collected writings lay, dozens now, each folded neatly, many with the thin ribbons of silk still wrapped around them. Some she remembered with sharpness, others she had almost forgotten. She touched them all, letting her fingers pass over the textures of old paper, the faint impressions of brush strokes. Then, one by one, she began to unwrap them, not to burn or hide, but to read, slowly, softly, aloud. She read into the growing dark, her voice barely more than breath, each word returning to her like an echo from another life. When she finished, she placed the last piece of paper on the table and looked out into the garden, where the moon was just beginning to rise, pale and low. The bell had not chimed in days. The fan had not been moved. The shell and the comb remained where she had placed them, quiet witnesses to a passage that had left no trail but changed her utterly. In that final silence, Aoi picked up her brush one last time and wrote, "If ever you pass through the wind that once held me, remember my name, not for its sound, but for how it held silence without fear." She folded the page and placed it beneath her pillow. That night she dreamed not of gardens or rivers, not of messages or footsteps, not even of cranes in distant skies. She dreamed only of wind, and in it she was not reaching, nor retreating. She was simply there, a part of it, whole, and finally truly